Hello, everyone. Welcome to Pod Damamara. I'm Jake Flores. This is the show this week. I wanted to explain up top a little bit about what's going to happen at the next couple weeks of the show. Basically, I started reading a book about John Brown, a biography, and it's really long and it's really good. And if you don't know who John Brown is, he was basically an abolitionist who existed in the antebellum era. Wink, wink. Remember that band? That's before war, right? I don't know. Fuck it. So John Brown's this guy existed before the Civil War, who was an abolitionist, who was a white guy who was really very woke and tried to end slavery personally by getting a bunch of guys together with guns and swords and storming a plantation, and his plan was to, ripple from there and essentially just, start a nationwide slave rebellion. It's very fucking cool. They don't teach you it in school. It's one of the cooler things in that category, And I wanted to do an episode about it because, obviously in the context of police abolition, this makes sense to talk about because there are dynamics and arguments about whether what he did was too far, whether abolition itself was too far, and those probably are pretty relevant to what people are talking about today. I also wanted to do it because, the reason I do this podcast is that I am from the South, where they don't teach you anything, and I am poor and Latino, and grew up trying to understand the world surrounded by Nicaraguans and Cubans and shit that had very complex pro-capitalist ideas, other people that had anti-capitalist ideas, and then everyone else who pretty much lives apolitically. And then I moved to New York, and 2016 happened, and all these things happened, and Bernie happened, and I met a few other people that were interested in socialism, and they went to the new school and stuff like that, and have a sort of like an education, like a proper education of this sort of stuff. And I don't, this is all DIY. I mean, I learned a lot of socialist stuff in college, like a little bit. I read Marx and Zinn and all that shit, and was pretty interested in sociology and things like that. But, college doesn't really complete that task. It kind of just spits you out. You get a little bit of information, and then go figure it out. And I also diverted a large part of my life to pursue, basically just the technical skill of stand-up comedy, right? So, I don't know. I was talking to another Southerner about this the other night on 4th of July, and I was like, and we were both talking about how they don't fucking teach you anything, and that's why it's so hard to radicalize Southerners, is because part of what's going on is it's kind of embarrassing that you don't know as much as these fucking socialists up here, and, that doesn't make any sense. For this to be inclusive, things have to be accessible, not insulting, and I'm a comedian, so I could take the fucking punch here. I can make a podcast where I'm a fucking idiot and I get all sorts of shit wrong, and I learn, and that's the fucking show, right? And I was thinking about that because I was talking to another friend of mine the other day about John Brown, and they didn't know who he was, and I was like, holy shit, I should make a podcast about John Brown because that's way easier to take in, and it's kind of fun, and it can be kind of, true crimey even, or like Last Podcast on the Lefty or something like that. Because this is just a fucking insane, incredible story. The book, I'll say this throughout the podcast, highly recommended. This book it's incredible. It's so funny, and so interesting. But yeah, basically I started reading it, and I started putting together show notes for it, and it's a long story. So, and it takes a lot of time to, I don't know how the fuck those Last Podcast people do this. It takes a lot of time to write out episodes like this. So what happened is, it's really long, and I'm not finished yet. So we're splitting it up into a few hour-long episodes. So today will be the first part of the John Brown story, the young John Brown when he's a kid and a teenager and a young adult, and some context and some background. And trust me, there's some pretty weird shit in there. So it's pretty good. So anyways, yeah, for the next few weeks, it's going to be, I think, part 1, 2, and 3, the life of John Brown. And then we'll just do other stuff on the Patreon feed and stuff. And yeah, maybe some other stuff just on the main show too. But I think this is like one of the cooler things we've ever done. So anyways, enjoy the fucking show, you freaks.
Lock them into positions of hopelessness and helplessness. The government gives them the drugs, builds bigger prisons, passes a 3-strike law, and then wants us to sing God Bless America. No, no, no. Not God Bless America. God damn America. That's in the Bible for killing innocent people. God damn America for treating us citizens as less than human. God damn America as long as she tries to act like she is God and she is supreme.
All right, I'm recording.
John Brown.
Brown's body
in the grave. That doesn't sound like a pro John Brown song, I gotta say. Just from those lyrics and the way they're the tone, it sounds like they're celebrating.
It's weird.
Just for the record,
because...
I was doing "Kickstart My Heart" by Motley Crue. But that was good too. It's more relevant. You guys are right.
That song is weird because it's about his dead body. Well, if you know the context, it's about his dead body.
That's one of the important points. That's one of the important points. Like, John Brown thought, I have more value as a dead man than as a living man in this fight. And he knew that he was such a powerful symbol that, you know, as the supreme white ally, slaveholders would have to kill him.
That's pretty rock and roll.
Yeah, but I think it would be cooler if he was alive and it was just about his body. You know?
Yeah.
John, like a bunch of Civil War guys that are just like, John Brown's body is so fucking hot, I'm going to go fight against the South.
Yeah.
People had like a good body back then because of malnutrition. So if you could get there, you could inspire a lot of people with just what you look like.
True. He did have piercing eyes.
Goal weight, John Brown, you know?
Yeah.
Well, he and Lincoln both, now that I'm thinking about it, were Clean Shave McGee for a while, and then they both went full beard, and then that's when they got, like, fucking hardcore, you know?
True. Oh, yeah, because he had a crazy... He looked like the guy from The Lighthouse when he had the beard.
Yeah. Yeah, but there's old photos with him with a clean shave, as with Lincoln. But a little girl suggested to Lincoln, you want to run for national office, you got to do something there.
Girl?
Yeah. Oh, wait, was she a big girl? You know the story?
She was huge. She was 10 feet tall.
Naomi,
yeah, beards and abolition go together, I think.
So a little girl ran Lincoln's campaign.
John motherfucking Brown, part 1. Hello, welcome to the show. Hello, the damned. Hello, the stupid children. Hello, whatever we're going to call you next. I don't remember why we call you either of those previous things, being entirely honest with you. I'm Jake Flores. Anders Lee is here.
Anders, damn, stupid child Lee here.
Alex Matak is here.
Brown clowns.
The first part of what you said got cut off, so it just said clowns or something.
Clowns.
Clowns.
What?
I'm into it.
I said, what up, brown clowns? My connection fucking
What
sucks.
up, Brown?
There you go. Okay, because we're trying to think of a good nickname for the
Jesus Christ.
fans. For the fans earlier, I said brown nosers. I think that might be a little too vulgar, so brown clown. I think that's the way to go.
Brown clowns is
That's
pretty good.
already a thing, and it sucks.
How about insane brown posse?
Oh yeah.
You know?
Okay.
And
That's what I'm
Naomi
in.
Naomi Karavani, welcome back to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us to talk about the motherfucker John Brown and all the cool things he did. I want to start off today's episode by sort of addressing the question, why talk about John Brown? Why do an episode about him? Is this relevant, or is this just a weird story? He's oddly enough in the news. I mean, I guess this was bound to happen. It's pretty interesting that this article came out in like the New Conservative today about him and is sort of being shared because
there's also a series coming out, right?
Is that what's going on? Someone they cast someone to play him, right?
Ethan Hawke.
It's a comedy.
Yeah, it's like
the trailer.
Yeah, it's sort of. By the way, is there is your cat a brown clown too? Is she getting? Sounds like she's getting in the fighting spirit.
Well, yeah, the cats are fighting behind me, but I don't know on what ideological terms.
Right. At Alex's where he's recording, there was also a literal cat fight, right?
Yeah, there's
before we start recording
outside. I don't know what their fucking problem is.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I might have to put these cats out too. If I'm going to ascribe them any faction in the story we're going to discuss today, I'm going to say they're what's known as a border ruffian, which is basically. We'll discuss the politics of it later, but they're basically drunk guys with revolvers that ride steamboats and care not for borders. Because they are not supposed to be in my room right now, but here they are, voting.
Here they are
on all sorts of horrible things. So, yeah, I mean, no, but the reason that there's a TV show coming out, the reason that there's, articles in the New Conservative is these all have a common root, which is that we just experienced something that raised the question of abolition, be it abolition of police.
Yeah.
Similar sort of story going on here, or a similar, piece of history with what happened with John Brown, because he was a key figure in the story of abolition of slavery. And I'm going to work off a book that I am in the middle of, that I read that came highly recommended. I sort of asked a few people, I asked Twitter people, I asked other people I know, what should I read about this guy? And, somebody suggested the W.E.B. Du Bois story about him. There's a few biographies, but this one stuck out to me because it is, it's really like inclusive in that it's a cultural biography, and I'll speak to what that means in a minute. But the book, in case you're wondering you want to read it or anything, I'm not going to get to everything in it. It's a long book. It's like 500 pages. It's called John Brown, Abolitionist: The Man Who Killed Slavery, Sparked the Civil War, and Ceded Civil Rights, by David S. Reynolds. Right off the bat, very intense. Quite a claim.
Yeah.
And
did you know he was the president during the Civil War? That was him.
So
almost.
What he means by cultural biography is this book extensively examines the context in which John Brown lived and the culture that begat him, and then his life and the things that he did within his life, and then the culture that came after him that arguably he, in a recursive way, like affected. So he was inspired by the world he lived in and, arguably shifted the tides of the world he lived in. And if you don't know anything about John Brown, you may have heard of him right off the bat, just upfront explainer. If you ever read like People's History or anything like that, John Brown was this white dude who was such a hardcore abolitionist that he just personally went fucking action movie and did Django Unchained shit and stormed a plantation in Harper's Ferry and tried to start a slave rebellion all by himself and didn't work, but arguably planted the seeds for the Civil War. And that's a thing that's sort of up for discussion. There are basically two things you have to address right off the bat when you talk about the life of John Brown in a story like this, and these are addressed at the top of this book. One of them is, did he sort of spark the Civil War by creating such an incident that essentially shifted someone like Abraham Lincoln, who was not a radical abolitionist in any sense, to become like the moderate figure that then could sort of like, the movement to actually go to war against the South could mount behind, right? That's up for debate. The second thing, right off the bat, is the question of whether he's insane, whether John Brown is a complete fucking lunatic. It's honestly
an unreliable narrator.
Up for debate whether he was of complete sound mind, because
but if we're going to use like psychological categories that wouldn't apply on that day.
Wait, so why do they think he's insane? He has like super strength?
No. So
fanatical.
Well, he was very inspired by religion, and he thought it was his destiny to die in this fight. And he sacrificed his sons too. His sons died in the course of this fight, and he like literally gave his life to the cause.
Yeah.
Damn, it sucks sacrificing your sons for the cause.
Right. It's if you're trying to like uphold a system and you sacrifice your life to do that, that's not like seen as mentally ill. But if you're trying to abolish a system or create a new system, that's cuckoo bananas. That's the way it's seen in society.
I mean,
well, I will reserve my judgment for the story.
Yeah.
So
you'll give a verdict later whether or not he's cuckoo.
Well,
you'll have to tune back in to find out.
I think the question of whether he's insane comes from basically, looking at his life, because he was sort of an iconoclast even within a subgroup of iconoclasts. So, being something like an abolitionist or these sort of other subgroups around it known as like colonizationists and free staters and stuff like that we'll get into, usually meant that you politically believed that all humans had the same rights, but most of them still believed racistly that other races were less than in their makeup, right? And so John Brown, in a very iconoclastic fashion, was just actually not racist. In a time when racism was the norm, he just thought of Indians and black people as human, and he also stuck out in his own milieu because he adopted violence. And we'll sort of talk up to like the point of him doing that, and what the second part will happen next episode or whatever, but we'll get to his first sort of murder. And, since he did technically murder someone, there's a question of, is this a story about a serial killer? This will sound kind of like a true crime podcast about, and that's when it turned or whatever. And there's a lot of questions about his sanity because he had a trial, and I think his lawyer actually tried to get him off by saying he was insane, and he insisted, no, I really wanted to do this. Here are my fucking reasons. And I think mostly the reason that he's retroactively questioned in terms of sanity is because politically people would like to undo what he's done and say, well, that wasn't, that was a sane abolitionist wouldn't have done that, to try to undo, I guess, the political point he was making, right?
Yeah, but I think you could say he's insane in the way that he's like clairvoyant, because everything he says came true. He's like, slavery will not end legally. There will be a fight, a massive fight.
Yeah.
Well, maybe you could say he's crazy in the way like Toucan Sam is crazy for Fruit Loops, but his
that's Cocoa Puffs.
Abolition.
Cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. I think Toucan Sam is of a sound mind. Sound mind.
Anders, do not dare correct me.
No. No, Anders
he is also
right.
crazy, but different.
Yeah. What's his melody?
Fruit Loops is the malady. And when I
All right.
say, God,
Okay, it's an you know what? Yeah, that is unusual and irregular and probably unhealthy for a bird of his type to
birds
be
can't even
infatuated
digest
with
that shit.
Yeah, that is
begin
wrong
with.
of him. Yes.
Anyway,
true.
my point is that he's like that, but for abolishing slavery.
Yes. Well, it's funny because the in the American Conservative article, there's a lot of time dedicated to the cost of war and the disease and all the death brought on by the Civil War. Not a lot about the consequences of slavery for the slaves, which to me seems like the kind of the point. But
Right.
one of the I think amusing parts of the article is
And did you say you found an article defending slavery in the American Conservative?
Well, no. Well, as the author made very, very clear on Twitter, I am not defending slavery in all caps.
Right.
But yeah. But he says,
I'm just crazy for it.
Follow your nose. I'm written by the Toucan in the American Conservative.
It is ableist to tell me about slavery.
But he said in 1862 that Lincoln asked Congress to consider a constitutional amendment that would guarantee compensated emancipation to any state, including those in rebellion, and that would agree to abolish slavery gradually by 1900.
Yeah.
And he blames abolitionists for, quote, that they torpedoed the proposal and demanded that they continue the war.
This bulletproof proposal we had going.
Yeah.
It was definitely going to work. It's pissing the cat off. I can hear it in the background.
I mean, we talked about that a little bit with Matt of just alternate histories that could have happened where, there's theories of like, well, eventually slavery could have petered out or whatever. But I think that strikes me as pretty naive to think that the South would. Holy shit! I gotta fucking get rid of these cats. I'll be right back.
See, there's unrest even in our time, and I think there's a lesson in that.
Everyone out.
Yeah.
Hey, Naomi and Anders, have you ever considered getting a cat?
We have, and I am again. Here's my deal. I like other people's cats, but I don't think I should be tasked with.
Listen, we have plants, and I went away for a week hoping to water them, and dying when I came back. And he swore to God that he watered them. So I went ahead and watered the plants, and he was like, "Oh, you water the plants with a pitcher?" He was spraying them, like
all right.
spritzing them.
Well, look at the thing we have. She bought like a high definition like thing that looks like a watering can.
I mean, would you guys make that mistake? Would you spray the topsoil of a plant hoping it survives?
It's still water. It's just a cloud of water.
I think anyone would make that mistake. It's a mistake anyone would make.
Thank you. Yes, it looks
Maybe
like a watering can.
Maybe you could work your way up to a cat and get like iguana.
Yeah, I would love an iguana.
They smell really
As long as you pick some animal that can fight in the background of our radio show, I think it's a good choice.
All right.
Yeah.
I think I got
All right, Jake.
Can you make iguanas fight?
No.
I think they have to be like the special kind where they're like, the ones you see.
Iguanas are too chill.
You can make anything fight, technically.
Yeah.
Okay.
Doesn't mean you should.
Yo, we're back.
Okay.
I got rid of two of the cats. So one of them is in here, and I think he's just will fuck off if he's by himself. But so you were talking about that fucking that new conservative article. What exactly? Because I didn't get a chance to read it. What exactly was their point?
Yeah, the American Conservative, written by Jim Bovard. The title is "Anti-Slavery Zealot John Brown is No Hero," and basically. His thesis is that, is really not that unpopular of an opinion, honestly, with a lot of American historians. At least, in previous decades, a lot of them have come around. But he's saying that political violence is always a bad thing and is always counterproductive. And John Brown was a fanatic, and he prevented the more incremental changes from taking place because that's what these people have to fetishize. And he talks about Henry David Thoreau, who he likes in one sense because, of course, Henry David Thoreau was anti-government. He was like, I'm a no taxes guy. I quietly declare war with the state in my own, I'm not going to pay taxes and spend a night in jail type of way, which a conservative, they're fine with that. But then he says that Thoreau, he wasn't really paying attention. He wasn't up on the news enough and wasn't familiar with the violent acts that John Brown is committing. And maybe if he was, then he wouldn't have supported him.
That's, complete bullshit because...
No. In the American Conservative, you're saying?
Yeah.
Our favorite magazine?
No, this book opens with, like a fun framing device opens at his funeral, which is attended, or I think a wake, more like the party after his funeral.
Hanging?
No.
Hanging?
No.
Okay.
The wake is the thing that comes after the funeral, which is the thing that comes after the hanging. If you had the party at the hanging, pretty weird in my opinion. Although, hey, why not? But no, there was basically there was a celebration of his life after he died, and he was, after the raid on Harper's Ferry, lionized by Frederick Douglass and a lot of these key figures. And I can't remember if Emerson was there. I think Thoreau was dead by then. I think Emerson might have been there.
Freddie D had to flee the country because he was a suspect in the conspiracy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He went to Canada.
Another person at this party was the father of Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women. So,
oh, really?
Yeah, I've been reading Little Women in quarantine, and it's about class war. It's radical.
It holds up.
Yeah.
I watched that movie. Those girls don't look related at all.
It's fucked up.
I also think they're all movie stars except one of them who looks like a normal girl, and I feel so bad for her. Because it's just like her and Hermione and Saoirse Ronan and shit. It's bullshit.
Well, the thing that I think a lot of these people miss is that violence is just and was just and is just in the way that slavery it still exists in the world. It is just a core part of it, right? It's a violent act, enslaving a person and enforcing their slavery. It's going to be violent, and so it's very difficult to imagine ending it in any way that does not include violence.
Right.
And he may point to it would have petered out eventually without the Civil War. Things would have wouldn't have worked anymore, and that it was already dying, and that they just eventually would have put itself down. And that I don't think that would have happened. It may not have, no matter how it ended, it would have been bloody. And if you look at a lot of slave owners who were starting to reconsider the system and say, incrementally, maybe we should wean our way off of slaves.
Not in my lifetime.
Yeah, they would always say that. They'd say,
TJ,
right. All the founding fathers, yeah, that's what they'd say. But one thing that people often leave out of this is a lot, especially in the 1830s, a lot of these slave owners who were starting to come around to the idea of, in 300 years, maybe abolition, it was in large part because of Nat Turner's Rebellion. Another guy in 1831, I believe, who led a slave revolt and killed a lot of white people. And that's scary, and so that's incentive.
It's one of my greatest fears.
Religion thinking it was his destiny to do this, and committed horrible acts of violence that a lot of abolitionists at the time didn't agree with.
But that
abolitionists, like the left, were always had infighting, always had big disagreements, and just didn't get along. Very different ideas about how slavery would end.
Right. Why did we? Fuck.
No. But I want to add to you, Jake. You were talking about why is John Brown coming up now, and I think a big part of it is what's the use of political violence?
Right.
We see these protests getting violent. Is it totally, is it going to lead us nowhere, or is there righteous violence? Does it exist?
Right. Yeah. Well, okay, that's what I was trying to remember. So you pointed out about that is that, that's something that Brown talks about a lot, and in regard to things like Nat Turner's slave rebellion, and basically the way he sees it is that slavery is a situation where you are at war. Like, if you are enslaved by someone, they are waging a war on you without you have no like participation in it. It's a de facto thing that is, I think that his entire life, especially like the first part here where he's sort of like working his way up to really like kind of like someone who's deciding to kill, like getting himself sort of like psyched up for it. He's really trying to come to grips with that, but he's the thing that he believes, but it's prescribing some pretty serious action, right? And he talks about it as being justified. And I think what's interesting is that, he's seen as a radical psychopath by a lot of people, but then what he does later on, eventually in one way or another, or not at all, if you fucking really want to make that argument, leads to war, which is state-sanctioned violence that everyone's okay with in this like interesting Foucault sort of way, where if it's supposed to happen, then not
right. I mean, that's literally the UN's definition of a state is a monopoly on the quote unquote legitimate use of force or violence.
Yeah,
right. I mean, the question's pretty obvious if you're a Marxist, because from a materialist perspective, the entire economic capacity of the South is in slavery. So obviously, you're not going to buy your way out of it or just tell them to stop it. You have to fight. Obviously. What else? Why else would they
win them over with ideas?
Did you just do a popper?
Well, I think there was
me. Yes.
I think there was
so casual.
Looking. God damn it! I wish I saw that.
And I think
just doing
the 1850s disillusioned a lot of people because there was some progress in the mid 1800s that would lead to, maybe more friendly laws towards abolition, and definitely not the expansion of slavery. But then in the 1850s, you have all the concessions to the South,
right.
and that kind of changed the course of abolitionism as well.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. Well, I mean, we'll get into like how some of these things move over a timeline, but I want to start the story here. It's fucking story time with his early life. Okay. So John Brown's father was a man named Owen Brown, who was a Calvinist, hardcore Puritan. He was born in 1771 in West Simsbury, Connecticut. And when he was 5, his father died of dysentery. So this book, by the way, is fucking great. Like, as far as
much diarrhea.
Just as far as stories go, this and The Young Stalin are two of the most fun to read things I've ever read. Because, it's history, so there's an extra element of when you're reading about this shit, you're like, what this fucking happened? That many people died of diarrhea and ague and cholera and shit. It's very funny. People just get knocked out left and right by shit like dysentery. It's very Oregon Trail. So there's a lot of that coming up, right? Highly recommended. I fucking can't recommend this book enough, just in terms of being a good read, because I'm not going to get to everything, and I tried to take notes, but there's so much weird shit that happens. So right off the bat, Owen Brown, he's got this horrible frontier life. He marries a woman named Ruth in 1794, and they bore a son named Salmon, who dies 2 years later.
Of course he did. His name is Salmon.
Everyone
were destined to make it past 3.
Was it Solomon?
No, it's literally Salmon. I know they're religious, but they're also frontier freaks, so all their kids are just named like Stick or Jedediah.
I mean the Caucasian babies speaking from experience, having been one, we do have like a salmon-like pigment. So maybe that's what they're going for.
Really? Anders, you were a Caucasian baby?
I was once upon a time.
Well, I think of the frontier life. It's like we might at one point have to eat this baby. So.
Oh,
That's true.
We might as well get it in our heads now that this is salmon.
I mean,
human.
The salmon swims upstream, so maybe it's like, maybe he came out feet first or something weird like that, you know? And then, I don't know.
Or he swam out. And
maybe it was just an ugly baby. Are we overlooking that possibility?
I don't know. But
like I said, pink.
Salmon, who's Owen Brown's son, died 2 years after his birth, but that's not the last we'll hear of Salmon, because the one thing that the Browns and that people of just this ilk love to do is just name each other after each other. So they just keep having babies. There's like 5 more Salmons. There's like another Owen. There's 10 Johns.
There's a school of salmon?
Yes, it's a hive. Brown hive. Actually, you know, John Brown does use beehive metaphors a lot when he does, yeah. When he talks about the raid on Harper's Ferry and it being ultimately unsuccessful, he was like, I thought that, you know, people would hive. I thought that Frederick Douglass and, you know, the whole hive would form, and it didn't.
Oh, God, that would suck so much.
I'm beginning to understand why people think he's crazy.
That would suck so much if we brought him back to life and he's just in the K-Hive.
Yeah, well, because he's
like, this fanatically, this is what we need to do.
You know,
came back to life, some white woman would be like, shut up, we don't need more white old men.
Right. I don't think John Brown would be in the K-Hive. I think that it's possible because he's like the type of white guy that owns a lot of African art and is like, you know, very just superficially like down, but he also is really politically stringent, and at one point in his life just stopped voting because he was just no one was good enough for him. I think he would be like a crazy fucking anarchist type person who's like, oh, I don't fuck Bernie Sanders, fuck all of them.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. You don't think he'd be like a white hotep with the Red Dead voice?
People on his side.
I'm sorry, say that again.
He managed to get so many mainstream people on his side, like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thoreau.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure he would be an anarchist or none of the.
Well, they were kind of anarchisty too.
Well, we'll get to that.
Writers, but they were, yeah.
We'll get to that because there's a lot going on with them, and then there's actual anarchists around this time, and what John Brown believed, which is its own thing, if you ask me. But so Owen Brown, his dad, detested slavery in a very Calvinistic manner and in the context of the American Revolution. So he, coming off the heels of the American Revolution, quickly sort of noticed the hypocrisy of Jefferson's philosophies and the fact that he owned slaves. So if you think that's a sort of thing that, like, well, it was different at the time or whatever. You know, people are watching Hamilton right now and they're sort of going, oh, yeah, but, like, you know, there's all this big message of, like, the past is just like that, you know? It's not. There were people at that time who were watching this and going, that doesn't make any fucking sense. Thomas Jefferson, one of them was Owen Brown.
Right. Just because you rap about it doesn't mean it's true.
Well, they just flat out, I haven't seen it, but they don't acknowledge slavery, right? It's kind of like a retelling that's done.
In Hamilton?
Colorblind? Yeah. No, isn't it?
No, Hamilton. Okay. The part that's weird is they cast Alexander Hamilton as being like virulently anti-slavery, and I'm not sure if that's actually real.
We just did a whole "Why You Mad About This," but to answer your, I mean, in detail, it's discussed there if you want to hear the whole thing. But to answer your question, the anachronisms in Hamilton are basically that slavery is not mentioned really, except when to anachronistically imply that Hamilton was an abolitionist when he wasn't, and also his wife, Elizabeth Schuyler, the Schuyler family owned slaves, and in the play or the musical or the fuck you call Hamilton, it's heavily implied that they didn't. So a lot going on there. And my opinion on it, honestly, is that it's attempting to be post-racial in a way that doesn't work, because if they included the slaves in the story like they should, you would have to address the question of why are these people enslaved, and that would bring up race, which makes the whole fucking non-racial aspect of Hamilton not really make any sense. But
right,
and two sisters sharing one man.
Also,
I've never seen it.
Anyway, we can't. There's like 10 million Hamilton podcasts happening right now, so we can't get too deep into it. We can't imagine what a hip hop musical about John Brown would sound like, but we'll get to that.
It'd be a little something like this. Jake, do one.
It's just him like singing a hymn. Like, wait, how does it's him praying? He's like, what do prayers sound like? I don't know. Beatboxing and then
These have a queen, and so do we.
Sure.
We gotta end slavery. And the stage is rotating, so that makes it a lot more visually dynamic.
It's someone beatboxing and then him just going, "Thy Father in heaven, take my shit to keep," or what? I can't remember how anything goes.
Take my shit to keep.
Take my. If I die before I wake. How does it go? I don't know. I can't remember this shit. Okay.
I don't even know which prayer you're doing.
If I die before I wake.
I think that's a Frost poem, no?
No, you're thinking that's Metallica?
No.
You're doing Metallica.
This is a real thing with like rosaries and shit. If I die before I wake, give the Lord my soul to take. I'm not making this up.
Those are the lines.
And so I think that's where we can start for his rap, and then we build up from there.
He's like breakdancing and shit, and he's doing that. He's doing that type of couplet, and yeah, I don't know. And then he has guns. We could make this happen. He's like an NWA guy.
The 10 slave commandments. Maybe that could be a song. It doesn't matter if we're derivative as long as we have the same spirit.
So moving on a little bit, Owen, I almost called him Owen Benjamin. Owen Brown was, a Calvinist.
The John Brown of his time.
Yeah, a true iconoclast.
So Owen was a big abolitionist.
Yeah, and he.
Sorry, I sound like I'm drunk.
The abolitionist.
Oh, we get some Pelosi voice.
Are you guys sharing poppers? Is that what's happening?
Yeah.
You're in the same room. I can see you.
Just gave them to her.
So he lived in the context.
Just gave her some poppers. Now she'll be all right. Sorry.
He lived in the context of the aftermath of the American Revolution and noticed that only Vermont had outlawed slavery. The 13 colonies still had slaves. And he had personal experience with a slave named Sam, who later died. He had a friendship with a slave when he was a young child. So this heavily informs, his ability to humanize black people, essentially. And this happens to John Brown also later on. I can't remember.
Can I add something about the culture around that time?
I'm sorry? Oh, yeah.
Could I add something about the culture around that time? Like the way children were brought up in abolitionist families. Like, I sent this to you. They have a abolitionist ABCD book. Yeah. I have it open now. It's like A is an abolitionist, a man who wants to be free. B is a brother with a skin of somewhat darker hue.
Oh.
All right.
And yeah, so people would bring up their children with these beliefs.
Interesting.
That's cool.
What is X?
T is for chains. There shouldn't be any.
It's probably like some biblical name or something.
Is it Malcolm
X? So instead of a red diaper baby, this would be a
brown diaper baby.
X is for Xerxes, famed of yore. A warrior stern was he. He fought with swords. Let truth and love our only weapons be.
The guy from the 300?
Yep, that's right.
Yeah.
All right.
Who famously had a lot of slaves.
W is for the whipping post.
Really?
Yes.
This is a dark way to learn the alphabet, I gotta say. Kind of distracting from the letters.
Well, anyways, let's move on. Owen Brown finds work as a cobbler, a farmer, a tanner. Eventually, John Brown is born with him and Ruth on May 9th, 1800 in Torrington, Connecticut. In 1805, when he's 5 years old, the family moves to Hudson, Ohio, following Calvinists and, their whole thing being that they're doing this thing called Into the Wilderness, which is a Calvinist Puritan sort of metaphor justification for, honestly not like colonizing, especially not in the way that the Brown family was doing it. Just they felt that a need to go travel that way and to set up, a collaborative society as opposed to a colonizing one. They are sort of like the first family that's nice to Indians, because this is at a time when there's like in a lot of these places a majority Indian population. Everyone else is still pretty racist, even if they're cohabitating. They're an anomaly in that they just don't have any of the weird bias in them to begin with, because they have these experiences, I guess, that are unique, where they're friends with Indians and black people growing up in a time when it's not done. They travel and fucking. This is where the Red Dead guy really comes in. I looked it up, and Red Dead takes place more kind of 1910-ish, and this is all like almost 100 years before that, especially Owen's.
What is Red Dead?
It's a video game about a cowboy.
Oh, okay.
A gamed video.
I was trying to trying to theorize what John Brown sounds like, and the thing is, we were talking about him like a cowboy, and he's in the Western era, but we were talking about him by referring to him as this guy from this cowboy video game that's set at the end of the Western era. And really, I mean, his dad is more Oregon Trail-y. There's a lot of like wagons in this story, and dying in childbirth. Everyone just dies in childbirth. There's like that sort of shit going on. So this is, I'm going to say, more
but
like...
there's no voice acting in Oregon Trail, and that's really where your problem comes in.
So what I'm thinking is he's a little bit more like, if you've ever seen Deadwood, there's a priest in Deadwood who's just very, like that. He's just a lot of, just very shook up all the time and intense. I think these are intense God, frontier people.
Yeah. I have not seen the show, but I think you nailed it, and I see it now.
I don't quite have a reference point like Red Dead guy, but we'll figure something out. So let's see. Young John Brown makes friends with Indians, slaves, and he's kind of a kid with a wild streak, running around catching frogs and shit, getting into snowball fights. At one point, he's in a gang of kids. The neighborhood kids form two gangs called the Republicans and the Federalists, and they have mock snowball fights with each other and shit. He likes wrestling other kids and shit, and his parents are worried about his soul. So,
right.
I
know you're out throwing frogs with the Federalists. Stay inside and learn your abolitionist ABCs.
Yeah. So during the War of 1812, Owen Brown works for General William Hull's army as a guy who runs like cattle and beef and shit to the army, and John Brown is radicalized against the military. He hates the hypocrisy, the violence, the murder he sees, ironically, and more than anything, he hates the fact that everyone supports slavery. And his parents teach him just literally, this is a thing, it's corny, and it comes from religion, the golden rule. Just that fucking, thing that's on the wall in religious people's houses. They just teach him, treat yourself and your others, whatever the fuck it goes. I don't know. Another thing he can rap in the musical is the golden rule, I guess. Do unto others as you would have done, do unto you. That's what it is.
Yes. Also, unfortunately, Jesus will be in the musical. It's going to be one of those.
Let's see. 16 years old, he has a public profession of faith. So when he's 16, he goes from being a weird teenager rapscallion to, loving the Lord. He becomes religious as fuck. He memorizes the entire Bible. He's got a brother named Salmon, right? As I discussed before, because I had another kid and they just renamed him Salmon. And at one point in school, Salmon...
Think of another name. Piss me off.
Trout.
Salmon, commits some kind of minor infraction, steals something, John Brown is now becoming a hardcore, like, what's the word for it? He just loves rules, I guess. Pedant, maybe. There's a word I can't fucking reach. It'll come to me by the end of this podcast, probably.
Nancy boy.
He goes up to the teacher, basically, and he goes, "Are you going to punish Salmon because he committed..." And the teacher goes, "No, I don't really care." So John Brown flogs Salmon for him.
Wow.
Yeah. See, there's another part of what's going on here in like a character study of John Brown that, unfortunately, I know he was badass, and I know we would love to imagine him as just the coolest human of all time, but there is a lot going on here, and some of it, he's a little bit of a hall monitor in certain parts of his life.
What is his religion again, or his particular sect of Christianity?
Calvinism.
I'm exactly where I'm going next with this. So here's what's really important about him. He sort of fuses a few different things in his mind on his way to becoming radicalized, and one aspect of it is the slave rebellion stuff, and one aspect of his hardcore abolitionism. And the third thing that there is the glue that holds all this stuff together is his hardcore puritanical Calvinistic faith. Now, the thing that's important to understand about Calvinism, especially in this part of the country at this time, is that, the fucking pilgrims and shit that came over here to start all this bullshit were like these weird people that left Europe because they were, in their mind, they weren't being oppressed by religion as much as they were like being oppressed in that they didn't get as weird and crazy with their religion as possible, as they wanted, right? They came here for the freedom to be even more fucking religious, which is a kind of a hard thing to wrap your head around, I guess. But in doing so, and specifically because of the conflicts that the Puritans had with their their oppressors back home, part of what they wanted to do, part of this big Protestant tradition, is that shit where I think I'm not a fucking theologist. I don't know if I'm getting this exactly right, but it was like them being allowed to read the Bible for themselves rather than have a priest interpret it for them, which is like a big Catholic concept. And that's why Catholicism is all in Latin and shit. And so it's a lot of DIY. Like, I know I'm going to have a personal relationship with God and all this stuff. But the other thing is highly anti-institutional. And so at this point, there were like 250 different sects of Puritan Calvinistic interpretations of whatever the fuck anyone wanted to do with this shit. They were also out in the fucking woods doing whatever the hell they wanted. So this is where like Mormonism came from, and Quakers and all sorts of other people that were just free to do whatever the fuck they wanted. And his particular strand of it was just, he was really into the work of Jonathan Edwards, who is this Calvinist who gave like these sermons called "A Sinner in the Hands of an Angry God" is like his most famous one, which is basically just a pilgrim screaming into the darkness, "You are a spider and you are in the hands of God, and he could crush you at any moment, but he just didn't do it because he doesn't feel like it. Fuck you." Like, it's crazy self-flagellization, and just everyone's a spider and a fucking wretched piece of shit. And
well, that's like a kink then, almost, right?
It's
that's like
very
BDSM for prayer.
It seems like there's a lot of that going on. There's a lot of flogging in this shit, right?
Oh,
yeah.
You're gonna flog me? I'm a spider.
I'm a little spider.
Flog me.
Kind of reminds me of Lutheranism in a way. I mean, it's still different, but growing up, like, I had this weird thing where, like, if I didn't get in trouble for something that I should have in school, I would like tell them that, I should also be in trouble for this thing.
I think that's an
Well, Anders, Calvinism is far more anti-authority, and that's why the symbol for Calvinism is that boy peeing on things.
Yeah.
Except in Anders' case, it's just a boy trying to pee.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
What does this mean?
A full tank.
What new exciting development is this?
Learned something new about Anders.
What is going on?
what's his name? Jonathan Edwards also gave sermons. That's what I was looking for. Eternity of Hell's Tower. End of the wicked contemplated by the righteous. Just crazy, just metal shit like that. And
nice.
A large part of this specific religion is about the concept of predetermination or predestiny. I can't remember what it's referred to as, but the idea being that God has just decided the fate of everyone's souls from the get-go. There's nothing you can do. You're either saved or you're not, predetermined. The actions of your life, basically the only thing you could do was fuck up and get unsaved. So just be as good as possible, and even if you do 100% right, you still might be fucked and going to hell. So it's very dour shit. And like Owen Brown wrote near the end of his life, my life has been wasted, and I wasted it on like vanities or something like that. These are
children.
Cut my life in 2 pieces. This is my last resort.
It is very new metal, yeah. So yeah, I guess let's see. This will come up later on, because what happens after Brown becomes a public figure after Harper's Ferry is that he is cast by the South as like, and this is why I like him a lot. I think this is why I started to really get excited while reading this book. All the Southern propaganda against John Brown is that he is a scary, satanic woodland heretic. And what's going on in the North in the woods is this crazy experimental shit with the, Black Phillip goat and witches and flying and stuff. And in the South, they respect order and institutions and things like that. And so actually they're more religious than John Brown is the argument. And they sort of, let me see if I can find it. There's a piece of like, what do you call it? Like a Ben Garrison cartoon about him. That's
John Brown.
Yeah, it's not by Ben Garrison, but there's a political cartoon. That's what I was looking for. It's from 1863, and it's titled "Worship of the North," with pictures of an altar with the word Puritanism blazoned across its base, and free love, spirit rapping, atheism, and Negro worship on the bricks above it. On the altar sits an ugly Lincoln, besides whom lies the slavery leaders of the Republican Party, including Charles Sumner and William Henry Seward. An African in tribal dress looms at the side of the group, holding an odd-looking spear. Hovering above all are Satan and a statue of John Brown, also holding spears. Right?
Whoa.
So
that's good satire.
There's a lot going on in this. One thing is that he's Satan, and another thing is that he's involved in something. So that word spirit rapping, this is another thing that'll come up. It's really interesting. And also it's kind of connected to some other stuff we've been talking about on the show. Just oddly, a lot of stuff going on in this specific time. This was also a time when spiritualism was very popular, and there were like just psychics and shit everywhere, and like mesmerists and people that would do this newfangled sort of like less institutional religious occult stuff that was, related to religion and not considered heretical, really, or heretical in like the North, for example. But the South would look at him and go, he's a fucking, he reads the Ouija boards and stuff. He's a spooky ghost,
right,
or whatever.
Right. He's a spooky ghost.
And then also the spears that he's holding in the political cartoons are pretty interesting because they're both emblematic of the all this archangel stuff that he's really into, and that I think he at one point had spears. I think on the Harper's Ferry raid he uses spears like they had in this weird passage in the Bible that he derives all this stuff from. But also it's meant to demean him as a Negro lover. He's got a spear, you know what I mean? Right. So it's like fucking 10 things on it at the same time.
Yeah, this is like the closest they had to like ether back then. It's like a diss track.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Trying to put this in terms Anders can understand. The world of hip-hop. His first love.
That's right.
He
You look
still
up.
doesn't get it. You got to freestyle.
I got
Yeah, I
a
can't.
freestyle.
No, Alex does.
No. Last name Lee, first name Anders. Jukin' fools like Deion Sanders.
No, you didn't freestyle that. You made that up, or you had that already ready.
Yeah, that's my go-to.
Yeah, that's a tattoo. I've seen that tattoo.
Like Deion Sanders. Why? How
Like my
about
name.
like
It rhymes.
Bernie Sanders? Okay.
Could do that.
So John Brown gets a little bit older, and he starts participating in the Underground Railroad. And it's not even really like an active part of his life yet. He's not really like a hardcore abolitionist yet. He's just, anywhere he goes, if there's an Underground Railroad, he immediately signs up because it's just, yeah, that's the right thing to do. Him and his dad work on it together. So, they help escaped slaves and hide them from, hordes of bands of white people. He works at the tannery his father runs, where he makes leather. In 1820, he falls in love with a housekeeper's daughter named Dianthe. And he's totally horny for her because she sings hymns and prays alone in the woods, which is...
I am horny for Diane.
Yeah.
That's a match. That's a swipe right.
Were
John
I
Brown.
to find a woman to say my prayers unto, Diane, it would be you.
Oh, yeah, we got the voice going. He's rhyming. This is all coming together. So she bears John Jr., Jason, Owen, and Frederick, and then 2 other kids that die immediately, and then she dies in childbirth. I mean, I guess this is all over the course of like a decade or something.
Wow. They should have put that in the cartoon. That would have really got them.
Yeah. So she's got this weird... There's speculation over like the mental health of her and her ilk, because like some of the kids that she bears have just what's referred to in the language of the times as like monomania and bouts of insanity. But I mean, that was just back then. If you were just annoying, or they didn't like you, or you were a woman or whatever, they would diagnose you with wood madness or something, right?
Right.
Let me see. I'm gonna pull up this other thing to here. We'll read a passage real quick, just about how as far as a family tree extends. John Brown fathered 20 children by 2 wives. Even in a time when families were large, the average American household had around 9 children. This number was extraordinary. More typical was the percentage of his children who did not make it to adulthood. Only 8, 4 by each wife, would outlive him. Among the remainder, 2 died shortly after being born, 6 were victims of childhood illnesses, and 1 was scalded to death in a kitchen accident.
Oh my fucking god! What?
Wink, wink.
Worst thing I've ever heard.
Yeah. Yeah, the past is so funny.
It really is.
Cooking salmon?
Oh.
Were any of them named Salmon? I guess that is my follow-up.
Yes, he had a child named Salmon. He will feature later in the story. So then he starts to become a little bit more of like this like hall monitor, like kind of Nazi guy, where he's just doing weird shit. Like while his wife is ill from childbirth, he stops because he sees 2 men robbing and stealing apples from an orchard, and tells them like, if you like repent, I will and give the apples back. I won't call the authorities. And then he just stops and gives him these weird lectures. His wife is like dying in the wagon next to him, like he like, pulled over. He's doing all this weird shit like that.
John, stop doing your spirit raps for these sinners.
Yeah.
John, it's not the time. Every chance you get, you're rapping at passerbys.
As his son starts to come to age, John Jr., he begins to discipline his children physically, and this extends to the point where at one point he tells John Jr. to come into the room and tells him, I have a marking of 10 things you did, or 18 or some weird number like that, and then he lashes John Jr. for a third of them. And then
this guy's canceled.
Then he stands up. takes off his shirt, turns around and hands the lash to John Jr. and says, and now you're going to whip me for the other parts of them. I'm going to take my punishment for you, and this will hurt even worse. I don't know, some crazy shit like that, right? So, like,
that is high level shit.
It's pretty weird.
He knows how to abuse. He knows how to like fuck the shit out of a child, like mentally.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe that's better to have the kid hit you after. It's like it's even.
I think it's
right, that way
psychologically
they feel bad about it.
I guess it is like, oh yeah, we're the score's back to 0. I don't know. It's fucking weird. These are, I'm going to say, points for he was a little bit crazy, like that argument. Some of the stuff is a little bit weird. But, you know, he was kind of weird and violent, but also he would nurse lambs back to life and shit. And, you know, he also would go into hysterical laughing fits. They said that this is like, the book is like, he was kind of fun. Like, he would laugh sometimes so hard he couldn't breathe for like no reason.
It's so cute. You know, when someone starts laughing and you don't know why and they don't stop.
Adorable. Yeah.
It's usually because I'm thinking of Anders watering the plants.
Yes, maybe he was just thinking of Anders watering plants.
He was probably just thinking of Anders watering the plants.
I thought so I did water them after all, huh?
No, he spritzed.
No,
Spritzed.
no, you
Nice.
didn't.
Spirit wrapped
You
the
spritzed.
plants.
I'm on Naomi's side now.
Another thing that he liked to do was debate people in like this really corny fashion about, you know, the like theological shit. So he would just school motherfuckers in public because he knew so much Calvinism and so much Jonathan Edwards and stuff. He also, and this, like I'm saying, this was during a time of like early capitalism and snake oil and things like that, and all this spiritualist stuff. So there was a practice called mesmerism, which was popular entertainment, essentially. Basically was just hypnotism. Like, it was just someone saying, look, I've got this tonic, or I've got this fucking, you know, psychic connection. I can hypnotize a person. Essentially a fucking comedy club hypnotist, right? This shit made John Brown furious because I guess it was, you know, it was not...
It's sinful, is what it is.
There you go. So
it denies the power of the Lord.
At one point, John Brown goes to a mesmerist show. He watches it, and he decides, I'm going to come back and challenge this mesmerist. And what the mesmerist does is he hypnotizes a woman and says, you know, through the power of hypnotism, I'm going to make it to where she can't feel pain, right? And so he takes this thing called a nettle, which is like a plant that's like stingy, and it burrows into your skin and it hurts a lot, right? And he applies it
spike balls.
Yeah, like a little burr. And he puts them on the woman's skin, and then the act is, you know, behold, through the power of hypnotism, she doesn't even feel it. She doesn't feel pain right now. So John Brown comes to this guy's show, and he heckles him, and he goes, I can prove that what you're doing is not actually it's not mesmerism. It's not real. I will do the same thing, and I will prove that through the power of God, you can block out pain if you have faith, right? And so the guy's like, interesting. I like to see where you're going with this. And so they do a show.
I'll allow it.
Yeah. And so they do a show where he does the thing and he puts the nettles on the woman's neck and she's fine. And then Brown's like, check this out. Put him on my neck. And he puts him on his neck. And he's standing there and he's fine. Right? And then the mesmerist takes ammonia and he puts it under both of their noses at the same time just to add one more element of weird. And John Brown fucking flips out, and he's like, ow, 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 ow. And he runs out of the room yelling and screaming, and he's up all night rubbing his neck on a street, like, lamppost because it fucking hurts so bad and itches so bad. And then he comes back the next day, and he goes up to the guy, and he goes, all right, mesmerism, maybe there's something to it.
Wow, this reminds me of this is the worst kind of heckler you can get at a comedy show. Is when they challenge to do your act through the power of God.
Yeah. I mean, he might as well embrace all the dark shit because that's what they were accusing him of anyway. You know?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting. I think there's just various religious factions all kind of doing weird dark shit, but then accusing each other of like, well, you're actually the one that's in league with Satan. Like, what we do is cool or whatever. It's not like one Christianity versus everyone else, you know? I don't know. So, all right. That just about sums up young John Brown up into pre-radicalization. So tune in next week to find out what happens next. You can't do cliffhangers with history. He's going to kill people. It's fucking cool. All right. Bye.